hearts be now and always acceptable in your sight, Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I went back through my Spotify playlist and found an appropriate song. Wake Up Little Susie. Seemed to fit with the gospel message. Wake Up Little Susie was a song first released in 1957. And it's best known, though, as a recording by the Everly Brothers. It's written from the point of view of a high school boy to his girlfriend, Susie. In the song, you may recall, the two go out on a date to a drive-in movie theatre, only to fall asleep during the movie. They don't wake up until 4 o'clock the following morning, well after their 10 o'clock curfew. They then contemplate the reactions of her parents and their friends. Now, at the time, the song was banned in places like Boston, but the song doesn't state that Susie and her boyfriend had anything improper going on at all. Indeed, it strongly implies that they didn't. The couple simply fell asleep because they got bored by the film. And as I thought about that, I thought, that's got real meaning for us today too, because the church has been silent for years. Just as the young high school couple falls asleep during a boring movie, I think the church has fallen asleep through laziness and boredom. And it ought not to be that way, but sadly it appears that it is. We've become enamoured with our past successes, the prestige that we had and the power that we wielded. Yet our influence in the community has fallen. Our baptism numbers have fallen. And our churches, up and down the country, and especially in the first world, are struggling. And we're struggling because we act and look like the world that surrounds us. There's very little difference between the world and the life of the average church person. Church-going people are cheating, stealing, and running from God just like lost people. Yet when confronted, often these same church-going people deny they do any of this. In our gospel reading this morning, we hear what Jesus wants us to be aware of during the time of preparation and anticipation as we head into this Advent period. Jesus, in this reading this morning, is completing his words concerning the last days. In today's reading, he gives us 3 clear words about those last days. And the first thing Jesus says in verses 28 to 32 is that we are to be warned. Jesus tells his disciples to learn this parable, and he delivers a word of warning to believers. When they see these events, he says, as he describes them, when they see them unfolding before them, then they are to be prepared. And since Jesus had already spoken of his physical return in verse 26, he reassures his disciples of his coming appearance in verses 28 and 29. He is near, we're told, and nearer than we probably like to think at times. Just last night I watched the news. You've got Iran on one hand and Israel on the other. And we witness today, even now, the ongoing hatred of nations towards Israel. There are the demands from radical Muslim extremists crying out for the destruction and the annihilation of Israel. And even our government, in a religious sense, seems to have turned their back on Christ as they contemplate dropping prayers and modifying oaths in Parliament. The fig tree has sprouted its leaves. And in verses 30 to 31, Jesus shows us his assurance of the event's eventual fulfillment. And he matter-of-factly states that this generation will not pass away until all these events have been completed. So which generation is he referring to? Well, when Jesus speaks of this generation, he is, I believe, referring to Israel in the metaphorical. And Israel, as a nation, is now over 70 years of age. Their enemies are numerous, and their challenges, even today, both geographical and political, appear at times overwhelming. But our God is able to bring them through the coming storm. And then in verse 32, we see Jesus' authority. At the time, Jesus did not know the day he would return. But does he now? Yes, I believe he does, because we're told all authority has been given to him as he sits at the right hand of the Father. And again, out of the news, it would seem that especially here in Invercargill, there are people who chronically run red lights. I was sitting at the Batch the other day and I watched the intersection, and yes, they do. I've heard people say that yellow lights are warnings to speed up before the light turns red. They are in fact warnings for motorists who safely prepare to stop. In some regions of New Zealand where this kind of behaviour is also prevalent, we have signs warning drivers of cameras which are capable of photographing them as they run the red lights. A ticket for running a red light will cost you $150 and you'll lose points on your licence. The cameras have significantly reduced the number of people running red lights. Well, just like cameras, warnings are given to Jesus' followers to believe and behave as his children. And just as we need to watch out for all the different signs when we're driving, so too do we need to be aware of the signs that are also given in an unsaved world as warnings that Jesus is about to return and pass judgment on the world. It's a time for all of us to wake up. Jesus tells us in verses 33 and 34 that not only are we to be awake, but we're to be working, to be watching, and we are to consecrate ourselves to being faithful. Much like a soldier on guard duty, we are to be constantly dedicated to carrying out our last command. And the commandment was given to us in the words of the Great Commandment found in Matthew 28, 18 to 20. And this we're told that all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded of you. And remember, I am with you always to the ends of the age. And that order has never been rescinded, and it applies to all of us. In the 33rd verse of today's reading, the phrase to be alert can be translated as to behold, to take heed of, to take notice of. It's the idea that we are to complete our assigned responsibilities. Everyone has their place in God's kingdom to carry out some form of work. Mine is probably different to yours, and yours will be different to the people you're sitting with. But regardless of what our responsibility is, we're to be faithful in everything that we do. We're also to communicate not only with one another, but also with God directly. And by this he means to come to him in prayer. Because we don't know when he's coming, we need to stay in touch. We'll recognise the signs of the times primarily because we remain alert and in touch. And then, in verse 34, Jesus gives an illustration that we are stewards of God's kingdom. We have a job to do, and we're called always to remain faithful to it. And I spoke about this 2 or 3 weeks ago. It means that we're to cultivate our fields of service. Stewards don't own what they possess. They simply manage what belongs to someone else. All that we have belongs to God. Faithfulness on our part is required because we will be called to give an accounting for the duties we have been given to carry out. Years ago, when I was at primary school, I got a holiday job looking after a neighbour's dog. It was a big, white, fluffy Samoyed called Sheba. And these people were away on holiday. You know, it wasn't a hard job for me to do. I was expected to simply feed the dog, provide fresh water, and walk it once or twice a day. Faithfulness to the task was all that was required. And it's the same thing with belief today. We're not always given the hardest jobs or the most challenging tasks, but faithfulness to the task is what's required. Yes, we are fighting a cultural war in a post-Christian society, but God knows this. It doesn't come as a surprise to God, and we are equipped to deal with that. So I would encourage you to get involved. It's not really optional, because in Scripture we read that we're commanded by Jesus to work continuously and faithfully until he returns. And then Jesus tells us that throughout our faithful activity, we are to be watching. The phrase "to be alert" means to wake up in verses 35 to 37. Christians are not to be sleeping at their posts. We are called to be awake, to be alert, and to be on duty. And because we don't know when Jesus' return will be, we should observe his warnings. Verse 35 makes it clear that we don't know, and we won't know on which watch he will return. But his return is imminent. And that means that it can happen at any moment. It's not immediate, at least it might not be, but it is imminent. Secondly, in verse 36, we are to obey his word. We don't want him to catch us sleeping on the job. Wouldn't be a good thing if he does. As an employee, to be caught sleeping on the job would usually mean automatic dismissal. So we have to take our responsibilities seriously. And finally, in verse 37, we are to occupy his world. Jesus is the rightful owner of this earth, this universe. He created it, he sustains it, and he is sovereign over it. But while we are here, we're to be involved in seeing others come into the kingdom. God has plenty of room in his kingdom for those who choose to trust in him. I think it's a wonderful thing that most towns and cities in New Zealand still have a fire station. Fire stations serve a great purpose. The staff in a fire station save lives. They put out fires and they provide other services to the community, especially those volunteer firefighters who give up their time to do that. But imagine if these firefighters spent all their time at the fire station polishing their trucks, cleaning their equipment, and just hanging out with each other. Think about what it would be like if they ignored the calls that an accident had happened, or if they continued playing cards late into the evening when they received notification that someone was trapped, or if they felt that they needed to finish polishing their truck while your house burned down. I think that as a community we would be seriously disappointed in their response. And yet, as the body of the church, we're too often too busy fellowshipping with each other and polishing the brass inside the building. And another soul slips away from God's kingdom. We can sometimes find ourselves having too much fun within our own space to really share the gospel with someone who we might consider to be an outsider. Our life can be lost to the kingdom because we didn't take the time to invest in that person. And sadly, that seems to be the state of many churches today. We have to continually challenge ourselves. Are we simply rearranging the deck chairs on a sinking Titanic? Or are we faithfully following Christ in obedience to his word and doing everything that we have been called upon